Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to take this video to talk about African philosophy, broadly construed, and the ways in which mythology relates to philosophy as well. Now, this topic, of course, is in reference to the article that I've assigned for this week that talks about the relationship between mythology and philosophy, specifically within the African tradition. So I'm going to take the time of this video to kind of talk about some of this terminology that's used, specifically mythology and philosophy, and also to talk about the kind of specialized branches of philosophy that we get in the 20th century, but most importantly, to focus on what exactly is African philosophy, kind of broadly construed. So the first thing I want to say, and this is just kind of a matter of clarification. So there's different ways to divide the history of philosophy. Now, when we're talking about the history of philosophy, we're really talking about world history for the past 12,000 years, basically. So it's helpful in this situation to create categories, broad categories. But I want to emphasize before I get started that these categories are in no way, shape, or form concrete. It's the same if you're dealing with history, right? When does World History 1 end and World History 2 begin? If you've had to take World History 1 and World History 2, historians will argue about when modernity, when modern history starts. It's the same for philosophy. There's certain categories that philosophers will use and refer to, and we're going to be talking about some of those today. So first and foremost, one way to divide philosophy is between Western philosophy on the one hand and Eastern philosophy on the other. So when you take an intro to philosophy class, such as the one that you're probably taking right now, you'll have readings, hopefully, readings from both. And when we talk about Western philosophy, ignore the different colors on this map. It was one of the better ones I could find, so bear with me here. When we talk about Western philosophy, we're generally speaking talking about the philosophy that emerged from the Mediterranean world, starting with ancient Greek philosophy to Roman philosophy, and then in the what's referred to as the Middle Ages to Christian philosophy, kind of broadly construed. That's kind of what we mean by Western philosophy. And when we talk about Eastern philosophy, philosophers are generally referring to the major philosophical traditions of the quote unquote East. And when they say East, they're almost always referring to Asia. Specifically, the schools of thought that we have covered, most notably the two major schools of Chinese philosophy, Confucianism and Taoism, and then the philosophy that emerges from the Indian subcontinent or Hindu philosophy. But already you can tell that this framing is problematic, because if the West refers to the Mediterranean and Europe and sometimes North Africa, and the East refers to Asia, specifically China, India, and Southeast Asia, well, what about the rest of the world, right? Did philosophy appear in these other locations? It depends on who you ask. And it depends on, it largely hinges upon what we mean when we use the word philosophy and how much gatekeeping we're going to do when we talk about what is considered philosophy and what is not considered philosophy. So one way to divide it is between East and West. Another way, and we'll come back to this question of, well, what is considered philosophy here in a second when we talk about mythology. But another way to divide it, and the reason why this East versus West is problematic, one is because, as I just said, it leaves out very large geographical areas, right? What about Africa? What about Japan? What about Australia, Russia, the entirety of the Americas, right? Are they not doing philosophy? Another issue is that later on in history, these boundaries become more and more fluid. For example, the prime example of here would be Islamic philosophy. So Islam, of course, begins in the 7th century CE, Common Era, in modern day Saudi Arabia. But within a few hundred years, Islamic civilization, that is, civilization influenced by Islamic practices, spreads throughout what is called the Middle East. And the Middle East includes parts of modern day Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, but also the North Africa, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, even pushing all the way to modern day Pakistan, India, and then, of course, the Pacific Islands could also be considered part of Islamic civilization as a whole. So you might want to say, well, maybe we can divide it religiously, right? If we can't do it geographically, because geography becomes fluid later in history once people start migrating and trading, and thoughts become expanded out other than the places where they originated from. Well, what about religiously? Like most of medieval philosophy in Europe could be classified as quote unquote Christian philosophy. And it's not so much divided geographically. So, for example, you have St. Augustine, a very famous ancient Christian philosopher who was from North Africa, right? Or during the Islamic Golden Ages, during the Islamic Golden Age, you had philosophers from Africa, from modern day Saudi Arabia, modern day Pakistan, all over the place. Well, the issue becomes once those religions become global, so moving now into modern history, and I already said the problem of defining, well, when does modern history start? Lots of different answers to that question. I would say that it starts really with the age of colonization, right? The expansion of the European powers into Africa, Asia, and then, of course, the discovery of the Americas. After colonization, after the industrialization, and I'll ignore most of this history stuff and leave it up to the World History 2 class that you take. But one of the things that starts to happen, going back to this classification of what does it mean to have African philosophy specifically, one of the things that starts to happen in the modern period at about the turn of the 19th century is an increase in academic specialization. So more and more people have access to education, which means that more and more people are studying. And this doesn't happen just in philosophy, it literally happens in every single discipline, all of the sciences, all of the social sciences, everywhere. So with increase in specialization, what starts to happen is we start to distinguish different philosophical schools of thought, right? And part of the way that we do this is by going back to that geographical region. So in the 20th century, we get the emergence of what can properly be called African philosophy, as well as things like feminist philosophy, South American philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy. Part of this specialization allows people from either particular ethnic groups or gender groups to specialize, to talk about philosophy from their particular perspective. And the idea here is that one's geographic place of origin, I don't know why I said that so weird, their place of birth, their place of birth, their ethnicity, their nationality, their gender identity, all of these are going to have an impact on how they philosophize and how they approach philosophy. Now, for the most part, they're going to be talking about the same things because the topics of philosophy haven't really changed over the past 2,000 years. So people are still going to be talking about ethics and art and culture and metaphysics. But the idea is that these background influences are going to shape the ways in which we approach these subject matters. And that's really where you get the emergence and the development of African philosophy as a unique voice in the modern picture. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so the first thing we need to talk about is mythology. And I apologize in advance because I'm kind of hopping from ancient history to modern history and then back to ancient history. Sorry if this is a little confusing. Feel free to send me your questions. So the article itself is about African philosophy, and the argument that's put forward, let me go back to my map real quick. So there's an interesting historical question, which is, where did philosophy begin? Where did philosophy start? And which cultures had philosophy? You can ask a very similar question. I'm interested, personally, I'm interested in the history and philosophy of science. And so oftentimes there's a similar question asked of science. Where did science originate from? And depending upon how you define that term is going to shape and mold your answers that you get. And this is why philosophers oftentimes get so hung up on definitions, because definitions matter, right? Especially in this context. So if you ask people, well, where did philosophy begin? The most common answer you get is ancient Greece. Philosophy began in ancient Greece with the pre-Socratics, and then eventually you get Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. A more educated person might say, well, what about Eastern philosophy? What about Confucius? What about Lao Tzu? What about the Bhagavad-Gita, right? Or wouldn't you consider those to be philosophical text? Yes. I mean, I think no matter how strict your definition is, you would have to include those. Well, not every culture, first and foremost, not every culture developed a system of writing. But even in cultures that developed a system of writing, not all of them developed the sort of epic poetry that we see, for example, with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, or the Gita in India. That sort of literary writing doesn't appear everywhere for various reasons. But one thing that does appear everywhere is mythology. No matter what culture you can think of, take your pick. All of the cultures that have developed throughout human history in some way, shape, or form have had mythological traditions. The article that I'm having you read is going to argue that mythology is a form of philosophy. So let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, let's define mythology and let's define philosophy to see if there's some overlap here. We'll also talk a little bit about religion to make things even more complicated, right? Okay, so every culture, every tradition has a mythological tradition. Well, what is mythology? Well, let's dispel some common misunderstandings to get started. So in 21st century English, when somebody refers to something as a myth, that usually has overtly negative connotations. If you tell me a story and I say that that sounds like a myth, what am I saying? Usually what I mean by that is that I think you're lying, that you made it up, that it's not true, or that it's heavily edited or exaggerated, something along those lines. That's how we use it in 21st century English, right? But that is not what academics mean when they talk about myth or mythology. So when we talk about mythology, what we're referring to, so we're talking about narratives, stories that are told, And these stories are told in order to explain something and or to teach some sort of lesson, or just generally speaking, to inform us about some aspect of the world, whether that be the natural world, nature, animals, plants, humans, storms, hurricanes, that sort of thing, or some aspect of our social reality, such as marriage relationships, love, that sort of thing. So myths are a collection of stories that a people group tells each other in order to explain some facet of their reality. Now, there's a couple of different categories here. Okay, I have two represented here. There's more. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the most popular sorts of myths. So creation myths are probably the most widely known, right? And again, myths seek to explain something about reality. What are creation myths seeking to explain? They're seeking to answer some of the big questions, right? Who are we and how did we get here? Why are we here? Every culture has creation myths, and those creation myths are almost always aimed at those questions. Where did human beings come from? How did human beings get here? And who put us here, right? So creation myths, we also have explanatory myths, and there's countless number of examples. Pick your favorite culture that you love learning about. Maybe you really enjoy learning about like ancient Egyptian culture. Just go to Google, type in ancient Egyptian creation myths. Most cultures have multiple creation myths, multiple explanatory myths, all that good stuff. So yeah, just go to Google, type that in, you'll probably find a few. So we have creation myths, we have explanatory myths. Explanatory myths seek to explain, they can explain all sorts of different things. Everything from nature, physical reality, to, like I said before, social reality. So let me give you some examples, and maybe that will help clarify me what I'm trying to convey, stumbling over myself here. So with creation myths, I mean, the classic example, just think, for example, the creation myths found in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, I think is where the creation myth stops. From the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? So what is the creation myth in Genesis? And again, when I say myth, I'm not using that in a derogatory way. I'm using it in a technical way. So what is the Genesis creation myth seeking to explain? Well, first and foremost, it's telling us how the world as we know it got here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So why is the world here? Why are all these plants and animals here? You turn, if you're a Jewish person from, first century BCE, you hear the Genesis creation myth. God created the heavens and the earth. God created the plants and the animals, every flying thing, swimming thing, however that goes, right? Oh, okay, that's how they got here. Genesis also talks about the creation of human beings, right? God creates man and woman, and he says of man and woman that they're good. And then in the second chapter of Genesis, we get a little bit more explanation that kind of moves into the explanatory myth, right? Why does marriage exist? Why do people get married? Well, God creates Adam. Adam needs a partner, so God creates Eve, and bada bing, bada boom, you explain marriage, and you also explain where babies come from, all that good stuff. It also explains why human beings have to farm, or why they have to struggle against nature, right? Adam and Eve are in the garden, they're kicked out of the garden, they're punished by God. Adam's punishment is he has to work the soil for food, for the fruits of his labor, right? And the work in the soil is hard, by the sweat of the brow. He has to own and produce his food, where Eve's punishment is painful childbirth, right? So you're explaining a lot of different angles there. Or if you could take, for example, the creation myth from the Gita. And that's not from the Gita, Upanishads, of the sacrifice of the holy man Purushna. Purushna, this god, this holy person, entity, not a person, sacrifices himself, and it's out of Purushna's body that the heaven and the earth is formed. But the explanatory part is that it's from his specific parts of his body that we get the different caste, right? If you refer back to the Hinduism lecture. So it's from Purushna's head that the Brahmin are formed. It's from Purushna's arms that the warrior caste is formed, that sort of thing. So myths serve multiple purposes. Myths, even though different cultures may not have written their mythology down, myths often play a central part in culture via storytelling, right? They're often conveyed orally, often performed as some sort of ritual, whether it's somebody educating the youth. Myths oftentimes play a central role in the education of children. They are often performed at religious festivals or during religious ceremonies. So lots of different roles for mythology and different types of myth: creation myths, explanatory myths, another popular genre that I didn't put up here. Myths oftentimes are intended to impart moral lessons, ethical lessons. Myths are intended to teach us how to behave and how to relate with each other, as well as to the divine. I have a definition of what a myth is here. I want to read to you all. This is from Maria Leach and Jerome Fred. A myth is a story presented as having actually occurred in a previous age, explaining the cosmological and supernatural traditions of a people, their gods, heroes, cultural traits, religious beliefs, etc. The purpose of myth is to explain, and as Sir G.L. Noam said, myths explain matters in the, quote, the science of the pre-scientific age. So they're explaining the world through the tools and the means that they have available. Thus, myths tell of the creation of man, of animals, of landmarks. They tell why a certain animal has its characteristics, why the bat is blind or flies only at night, why or how certain natural phenomenon came to be, why the rainbow appears, or how the constellation Orion got into the sky, how and why rituals and ceremonies begin, and why they continue, right? So myths serve a very utilitarian purpose within a people's culture to explain everything from the origins of humanity, even sometimes of the gods themselves, but also as mundane things as, well, not really mundane, but as commonplace things such as marriage, relationships, and what sort of attitude children should have towards their elders type thing. Okay. So I have a quote by Joseph Campbell. Before I get into it, provide you a little bit more historical context here about the importance of mythology. So for most of the history of philosophy, there was kind of a clear demarcator, a clear separation between what we would consider like philosophy proper and mythology or religion. So throughout the Middle Ages, both in the Christian world and in the Islamic world, philosophy and religion were kind of tightly held together. What you'll start to see, at least in Europe, at the turn of the 16th and 17th century, for the very first time, you get philosophers who aren't so keen on religion, and who, I'm thinking of philosophers like Hume, Nietzsche, eventually the existentialist of the 20th century, that start to kind of drive this wedge between philosophy and religion. At the same time, however, you had historical and psychological investigations into mythology and what mythology means, especially what mythology means for the people who practice those traditions that start to develop in the 20th century, that kind of reignites the study of mythology. Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung on the psychological psychology front are kind of big players in this game. And what people like Jung and Campbell will argue is that mythology was an integral part of these people's worldview and an integral part of these people building and constructing their worldview. So this is what Campbell says about mythology. Throughout the inhabited world, in all times and under every circumstance, the myths of men have flourished, and they have been the living inspiration of whatever else may have appeared out of the activities of the human body and mind. It would not be too much to say that myth is the secret opening through which the inexhaustible energies of the cosmos pour into human culture manifestation. Oh, that's a heavy sentence, right? Religions, philosophies, arts, the social forms of primitive and historic man, prime discoveries in science and technology, the very dreams that blister sleep boil up from basic magic ring of myth. So, although mythology was underplayed throughout the history of philosophy, in the 20th century, what we see is kind of a reopening of that case. And for people like Campbell, mythology, I don't know why I said that strange, myth does provide the kind of cultural foundations for later things like science and philosophy, that mythology was human beings' first attempt to explain and understand the cosmos and our place in the cosmos. What, if anything, is the difference between mythology and philosophy? Like I said before, the article that I gave you, the central claim here is that mythology is a form of philosophy, an early form of philosophy, right? So what is philosophy? We talked about this the first week of the class. Philosophy is a search for a fundamental understanding of the world around us through the process of critical thinking and critical discussion. Well, it certainly seems that some aspects of mythology overlap with the study of philosophy. One of the branches of philosophy is cosmology, understanding the universe, the world, and how all of that got here. Well, we've already seen some examples where mythology is an attempt to explain that. Other examples, probably the biggest example would be ethics, right? Ethics is a branch of philosophy, and there are countless numbers of myths that are intended to teach some sort of moral lesson. The biggest difference here really boils down to style, right? Myths are almost exclusively narratives, stories. Whereas on a surface level, philosophy doesn't tend to be so until you start to inspect it a little closer. Look at some of the earliest philosophical examples from those Eastern and Western traditions. Plato in Greek philosophy. Plato is considered Albert North Whitehead, a 20th century philosopher, said that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. That's how important Plato is for the history of philosophy. Often considered the father of philosophy, started philosophy. Plato used mythology all the time, all the time. We read together Plato's Euthyphro, in which Socrates is having a debate with Euthyphro the priest about the nature of piety. What do they spend the entire dialogue talking about? Greek mythology, the relationship between the gods and human beings. Not only that, Plato actively uses mythology to explain certain points. You could see this, for example, Plato's Republic is probably the chief example of this. Plato uses the ring of Gyges to explain morality, what we would call meta-ethics. Are people good? because they're abiding by some sort of standard laws? Or are they good because they'll be punished if they don't abide by those laws? He tells a story to illustrate that point. Think of Plato's allegory of the cave, right? Allegory is different from mythology, but still, he's telling a story to highlight a point there. Look in the Eastern tradition. Look at Taoism, for example. The Tao Te Ching is a book of poetry, yet it's also considered a book of philosophy. So once you start to analyze and examine it, the difference between the two, and this is the point of the article mostly, that the difference between the two sort of fades away. And so African philosophy, according to the article, is not just a 20th century phenomenon, but we can also look at ancient African philosophy by examining ancient African mythology to get a sense of what ancient Africans were telling us about the nature of the cosmos. And he gives some, he kind of dwells upon some important aspects of ancient African philosophy that he kind of as the takeaway message there. And I'll leave that for you to read that last section of the article. And here we have another definition of African philosophy by Lewis Gordon. African philosophy is a species of African thought which involves the theoretical questions raised by critical engagement with ideas in African cultures and their hybrid, mixed, and creolized forms worldwide. So it's not just limited geographically to Africa itself, because African thought and culture has migrated, especially in the New World, in the Americas. Since there was no reason for the people of the African continent to have considered themselves African until the identity was imposed upon them through conquest and colonization in the modern era. This area of thought also refers to a unique set of questions raised by the emergence of Africans and their diaspora, here designated by the term Africana. Africana philosophy refers to the philosophical dimensions of this area of thought. And the article, to add on to that, would say that it extends well before colonization, back into deep history, into ancient history, and that these mythologies are a part of that conversation. I hope this was somewhat helpful and provided some sort of clarity on the terms that are going to be used in the article. If you have any questions about this or anything that I mentioned in the video, please feel free to reach out. See you all next time.